The old iron gates of whispering winds. Cemetery loomed before me as I pulled into the deserted parking lot. Through the rusty bars, rows of crumbling headstones faded into the gathering dusk like crooked teeth. An eerie stillness hung over the sprawling graveyard, as if even the trees dared not stir for fear of disturbing the dead. I cut the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and watching my breath fog the windshield. Part of me wanted to drive away from this place, to forget I'd ever agreed to this night watch job. But I needed the money, and the cemetery board had been desperate to find someone willing to take the overnight shift. Sighing, I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and stepped into the biting October chill. My boots crunched over fallen leaves as I made my way to the small security hut nestled among a cluster of gnarled oaks. A lone light flickered above the door, illuminating a weathered sign that read, "Whispering Winds, Cemetery, Est, 1847. A stooped figure emerged from the shadows, making me jump. "You must be Gary," a gravelly voice said. I turned to find a wizened old man regarding me through rheumy eyes. His face was as lined and weathered as the trees, his clothes tattered and worn. "Name's Eben. I'm the groundskeeper." He led me inside the hut, which was barely larger than a tool shed. Banks of flickering monitors showed grainy black and white footage of the cemetery grounds. "These'll let you keep an eye on things. Eve'll let you keep an eye on things," Eben said, gesturing to the screens. "Mostly deer and such wander in at night. But sometimes," he trailed off ominously. "Sometimes what?" I asked, unnerved by his tone. Eben just smiled, revealing a gap where his front teeth should have been. "You'll see if anything happens. I best be getting home before dark. You lock up tight now, you hear?" And with that chilling parting remark, he shuffled off into the gathering gloom. I settled uneasily into the rickety chair, pulling my jacket tighter as the temperature dropped. On the monitors, shadows stretched long and strange across the headstones as dusk deepened into night. An owl hooted in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a lonely howl rose and fell on the wind. I flipped through the camera feeds, trying to pick out details in the grainy black and white. Mostly, I saw empty rows of graves standing silent sentinel over the dead. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this place gave me an uneasy feeling, like eyes watching from the darkness beyond the camera lenses. My imagination was running away with me, I told myself. There was nothing to be afraid of here. I just had to make it through the long night, and the extra cash would be worth it. Trying to settle my nerves, I pulled out a textbook and focused on studying, letting the drone of cicadas and rustle of leaves become white noise in the background. That's when I noticed the shadows on camera 3. At first, they seemed normal, just trees swaying in the breeze. But as I watched, the shadows seemed to detach and slip among the headstones with an eerie, fluid motion. I blinked hard and leaned closer to the screen, certain my tired eyes were playing tricks. But the shadows slid and coalesced in ways that couldn't be explained by the cemetery statuary or plant life. A chill crept up my spine as I stared, transfixed at the impossible movements on the monitor. This couldn't be real. There had to be a rational explanation. Didn't there? I glanced at my watch, hoping the long night was nearly over, but it was only 10. With a sinking feeling, I settled back to keep watch, no longer sure what might be out there in the darkness, beyond the reach of my cameras. The shadows continued their strange dance across the camera feeds as the night deepened. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. But each time I looked away and looked back, the shadows seemed to shift and flow with an eerie fluidity I couldn't deny. A scraping sound drew my attention to camera 1. At first, I saw nothing but the familiar rows of graves, standing silent sentinel. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye near the old records building. I leaned closer, straining to make out details in the grainy image. Was that a figure slipping around the side of the crumbling stone structure? My heart rate spiked as I watched the empty cemetery grounds, waiting for another sign of movement. When nothing else appeared, I tried to convince myself it had just been a trick of the light or some nocturnal animal, but a nagging sense of unease persisted, like ants crawling over my skin. A screech of static made me jump as camera 3 cut out with a flash of snow. I tapped the monitor impatiently, hoping to restore the feed, but the screen remained blank. Sighing, I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside to check the camera. Maybe a loose connection had come undone, or some wildlife had gotten tangled in the wires. The cemetery gates stood open as I walked among the headstones, flashlight beam dancing over weathered names. Eben must have forgotten to lock up after leaving, I thought, with a twinge of annoyance. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes that could have been voices or merely the sighing of branches. I picked my way carefully toward the camera, mounted on a gnarled oak, playing the light over the ground in search of clues. That's when I noticed the deep gouges raked into the soft earth, as if something heavy had been dragged. My light traced the furrows, leading away into the darkness between crooked rows of graves. A prickle crept up my neck as I stood frozen, heart pounding. Those marks hadn't been made by any animal I knew of. Swallowing hard, I turned and hurried back to the security hut, suddenly desperate to be inside with solid walls around me. But as I glanced back, I caught a flicker of movement near the old records building that froze me in my tracks. 2 glowing orbs peered from the shadows, reflecting the flashlight beam. They watched me with an intensity that raised the hairs on my arms. I stood paralyzed, half expecting whatever hid there to emerge. But after a long, tense moment, the orbs simply blinked out as whatever owned them slipped back into the night. Shaken, I broke into a run and barricaded myself inside the hut, locking the flimsy door behind me. My hands shook as I checked the cameras, dreading what I might see. But the feeds showed only the familiar rows of graves, standing silent and still. I sank into the chair, rubbing my eyes as if to scrub the memory of those glowing orbs from my mind. Exhaustion and fear warred within me, each battling to claim dominion over my senses. Sleep tugged at my consciousness like a siren's call, tempting me to surrender awareness. But every time my lids grew heavy, images of dragging furrows and watching orbs jolted me back to alertness. I needed answers, if only to calm my fraying nerves. Digging through the hut's clutter, I unearthed a thick binder labeled Cemetery Records. Thumbing through musty pages, I found articles about the graveyard's history and lists of the deceased buried within its boundaries. One name leapt out. Eben Whisper, the cemetery's original owner, from whom it took its name. According to the records, Eben Whisper had been a reclusive farmer who donated the land for the graveyard upon his death in 1847. But rumors persisted of strange rituals held on the property and people who vanished within its borders, never to be seen again. Could there be a connection between this sinister past and the shadows haunting my camera feeds? A creak from outside made me jump, dropping the binder. I peered through the window into inky blackness, straining to detect any movement, but the cemetery remained as still and silent as a tomb under the wan light of a crescent moon. Whatever had made the noise was no longer there, if it had been there at all. My imagination was running wild. I chided myself. There was a rational explanation for everything I'd seen and heard so far. Still, as the long night stretched on and the shadows seemed to deepen, I found myself doubting the solidity of what was real and what was merely a product of an overactive mind. All I knew for certain was that I had to get through these long hours until dawn, for my own sanity, if nothing else. I turned back to the monitors, hoping their static images would calm my fraying nerves. But a new development on camera, too, sent a chill through my bones. The camera itself was gone. In its place was only a jagged stump where it had been torn from the tree. Wires dangling like exposed veins. Whatever was out there, it was growing bolder by the hour, and I was trapped inside with it. Dawn seemed an eternity away as the night deepened its hold over whispering winds, cemetery. On the monitors, the familiar rows of graves had transformed into a maze of shadows, concealing unknown threats. Every flickering image and whisper of wind sent my pulse racing, imagining glowing eyes peering from the darkness. I paced the cramped security hut, rubbing my arms against the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. What was happening in this place? Was my mind truly unraveling after hours of sleep deprivation? Or were darker forces at work among the headstones? A scraping sound drew my gaze back to camera one. At first, all seemed still. Then a shadow detached itself from a gnarled oak and slipped between the graves with an unnatural, fluid grace. I leaned closer, straining to make out details in the grainy feed. Was that a figure dragging something behind it? Or was the shadow of a branch playing tricks in the moonlight? As I watched, another shadow emerged to join the first. They seemed to converse in the empty cemetery, their movements too fluid, too coordinated to be anything natural. A chill crept up my spine as their heads turned in unison, as if sensing my stare. Two glowing orbs materialized where their faces should be, burning with an intensity that raised the hairs on my arms. I stumbled back from the monitor, heart pounding. This couldn't be real. Ghosts and spirits belonged in stories, not roaming an actual graveyard under the light of the moon. But something was haunting these grounds, and it had taken a disturbing interest in the night watchman barricaded helplessly within the security hut. A creak from outside made me whirl, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Silence answered me, as heavy as the darkness pressing against the walls. I was alone with the monitors and my fraying sanity. Or was I? What if those shadows had followed me inside, waiting for me to let down my guard? I needed answers, if only to calm my nerves. Grabbing the binder of cemetery records, I pored over musty pages recounting whispering, wind-sinister past. According to local lore, the graveyard's original owner, Eben Whisper, had been a reclusive farmer who took strange interest in the occult. Rumors swirled of rituals held on the full moon, with strange lights and noises disturbing the neighbors. Several locals went missing over the years, including Whisper's wife, though no evidence of foul play was ever found. When Whisper donated the land upon his death, an unusual clause in his will stipulated the cemetery must be run according to his original specifications in perpetuity. Could Whisper's occult activities be disturbing the cemetery to this day? I glanced at my watch. It was nearing midnight, the witching hour when supernatural barriers were said to be weakest. A creak from the outer wall made me jump, dropping the binder with a clatter. Heart pounding, I peered through the window into the inky night, straining to detect any movement. At first, all seemed still among the graves. Then a shadow detached itself from a gnarled oak and slipped between the headstones. I watched transfixed as it drifted among the markers with an eerie, fluid grace, as if born on the night breeze. As it passed beneath a waning moon, the shadow seemed to take the indistinct shape of a man in a long coat and hat. I rubbed my eyes hard, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks. But when I looked again, the shadowy figure had stopped and was staring directly at the security hut, as if sensing my gaze. Two glowing orbs materialized where its face should be, burning with an intensity that raised the hairs on my arms. For a long, tense moment, we stared at each other, man and shadow, across the gulf between reality and whatever lay beyond. Then it turned and drifted away between the graves, melting into the night. I sank to the floor, clutching my knees, as an icy realization took hold. I was no longer alone in the cemetery. Something had been watching me from the moment I arrived, and it was growing bolder with each passing hour. Whatever haunted these grounds had made me its focus, and I was trapped inside with no escape. Dawn seemed an eternity away, as the long night stretched on. I paced the cramped security hut like a caged animal, jumping at every creak and whisper of wind. Sleep tugged at my consciousness, but every time my eyes grew heavy, images of glowing orbs and drifting shadows jolted me back to alertness. On the monitors, the familiar rows of graves had transformed into a maze concealing unknown threats. I watched transfixed as shadows detached themselves from trees and drifted among the markers with an eerie, fluid grace. Sometimes they seemed to converse, heads turning in unison, faces replaced by burning orbs. Were these remnants of Whisper's occult rituals, disturbed from their eternal rest? Or something even more sinister, drawn to the graveyard by the barrier between worlds, weakening as midnight passed? All I knew for certain was that I was trapped inside with them, a mouse in a maze with owls circling overhead. As the witching hour came and went, dawn finally began to lighten the eastern sky. Pale fingers of rose and gold pried back the velvet curtains of night, chasing the shadows back to their crypts. Emboldened by the returning sun, I decided to venture out and search for the missing security camera, hoping its discovery might offer clues or calm my fraying nerves. Armed with flashlight and a heavy wrench for protection, I picked my way carefully between the graves. The cemetery seemed almost peaceful in the rosy half-light, shadows shrinking back to reveal familiar rows of weathered headstones. Birdsong greeted the new day as a breeze whispered through oak boughs, heavy with Spanish moss. I searched the area where Camera 2 had been torn down, but found no clues, only torn wires dangling from the gnarled tree trunk. As I cast about, my light fell upon a set of deep gouges raked into the soft earth. They led away between the graves toward a crumbling stone building, overgrown with ivy. The old records building, I realized with a chill. According to the binder, this was where Whisper kept occult journals and artifacts from his strange rituals. Gripping my wrench, I followed the dragging marks to a weathered door, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. It creaked open at my touch, releasing a musty exhale into the dawn. Inside, the single room lay in disarray. Rotting shelves had collapsed, spilling moldy tomes and shards of pottery. Cobwebs veiled arched windows, filtering dull light. I picked my way through the debris, playing my light over the walls. Scrapes and gouges marred the stone, as if something heavy had been dragged within. A glint caught my eye amid fallen leaves. I brushed them aside to reveal a rusted metal plate set into the floor, engraved with strange symbols. Taking a steadying breath, I grasped an iron ring and pulled with a grunt. Dust puffed as the trapdoor swung open on protesting hinges, revealing a narrow staircase leading into blackness. My light revealed earthen walls shored up with wooden beams as I descended. The air grew thick and musty, carrying a strange metallic tang. A squeal echoed up from the depths, raising the hairs on my neck. I paused, heart pounding, then steeled my nerves and continued down until my light fell upon a small chamber. A gasp escaped my lips. Chains and manacles hung from the walls, rusted but all too real. In one corner, a dark stain seeped into the dirt like spilled wine. Scrapes and gouges marred the walls, as if something heavy had been dragged within. I backed up the stairs, images swirling in my mind, questions crowding my thoughts. What terrible rituals had Whisper performed down here? How many had gone missing over the decades, their fates sealed within these earthen walls? A creak from above jolted me from my dark musings. I bolted up the stairs and out of that place of secrets, slamming the trapdoor behind me as if to lock away the horrors it contained. But as I leaned against the outer wall, struggling to steady my racing heart, I realized the cemetery's darkest mysteries were far from solved, and I was still trapped within its borders, alone with whatever haunted these grounds. Dawn's rosy light had faded, leaving the cemetery shrouded once more in gloom. I paced the security hut, replaying the horrors uncovered in the records building. What terrible rituals had taken place in that underground chamber? And what lingering remnants of Whisper's occult activities still haunted these grounds? As night fell, the familiar shadows returned to drift among the graves. I watched them slip between the markers, sometimes pausing as if in conversation, faces replaced by burning orbs. Were they remnants of Whisper's rituals, disturbed from their eternal rest? Or had I unearthed something even more sinister? All I knew for certain was the barrier between worlds grew thin as midnight approached once more, and I was still trapped within the cemetery's borders, alone with whatever prowled among the headstones under cover of darkness. My light fell upon a shadow detaching itself from a gnarled oak. It drifted toward the security hut with an eerie, fluid grace, as if borne on the night breeze. Two glowing orbs materialized where its face should be, burning with an intensity that raised the hairs on my arms. We stared at each other across the gulf, man-shadow, as the witching hour struck midnight. A scraping sound drew my gaze to the hut's outer wall. Deep gouges marred the wood, as if something heavy had been dragged against it. My light fell upon a dark stain seeping into the earth, smelling of rust and decay. A squeal rose from the shadows, raising primal fears, long dormant. I backed away, heart pounding. As the shadows converged on all sides, whatever haunted these grounds had grown tired of toying with its prey. It was time to face whatever prowled the cemetery and escape this place or perish in the attempt. Grabbing my flashlight and wrench, I plunged into the night. Shadows drifted among the graves, cutting off any route to the gates. I picked my way between the markers, playing my light across the inscriptions. Ahead, the records building loomed like a mausoleum, windows dark sockets. A scraping sound rose behind me. I whirled to find the shadows closing in, drifting among the graves with fluid grace. Their movements seemed almost choreographed, herding me toward the stone structure. My light fell upon the trapdoor, hanging ajar as if beckoning me to unlock its final secrets. Heart pounding, I descended into the underground chamber for a final confrontation. My light fell upon manacled walls and the dark stain in the corner. A squeal rose from the shadows as two glowing orbs materialized before me. A chill crept up my spine as I realized my pursuer had been here all along. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, brandishing my wrench against the darkness. Silence answered, but for the scraping of chains. Then a gravelly voice whispered through the chamber, echoing down from forgotten nights. "This land is mine. All must obey." The rites. I backed away as the shadows converged, drifting among the chains with fluid grace. Two glowing orbs burned where a face should be, reflecting my own terror. With a scream, I swung my wrench against the darkness. A shriek rose as the orbs vanished, shadows melting back into the walls. Panting, I bolted from that place of secrets, scrambling up the stairs and out into the night. The cemetery gate stood open as if beckoning me to flee. I ran without looking back, bursting from the iron bars into the outside world as the first rays of dawn lightened the eastern sky. Whispering winds. Cemetery faded into the mist behind me. But I'll never forget the terrors that stalked among the headstones, or the Groundskeeper, who still clings to the rituals of the past. Some mysteries are better left undiscovered. As for me, I've faced living nightmares and emerged with a new understanding of the world beyond what we can see.